the patron saint of humans. Humanity had long since entered the galactic sphere, carving out its own little section in the inner Orion arm and setting up its borders in conformity to galactic regulations. It had set up its trade systems, shown its ability to sustain itself, given evidence of its military strength and signed agreements to aid others in the sphere should calamity, whether internal or external, befall them. But the one criterion they had never managed to fulfill? They had never introduced their god to the other species. It was assumed that they were like the Clamere, a species with no god, which had survived through eons on sheer luck. This, however, was not the case, for humanity had simply not met their god, not as a species, not until it was their time to meet it. And it stayed this way until the Orus conflict. The Orus were a species of pure evolution. When they finally broke their atmosphere, it was not through the construction of rockets and ships, but instead they simply evolved to interact with gravity like no other could, in such a way that they could fly into space on a whim. They continued to evolve, gaining the ability to spawn spore fields as they flew, tracking oxygen and nutrients with them, allowing them to begin their expanse into the stars. This, however, required a great number of resources, and always resulted in the death of the world they left behind. When the Orus reached human space, the galactic community was at a loss for what to do. In line with the Conservation of Lesser Species Act, they decreed that military aid was out of the question, and any species providing military aid suffered crippling sanctions. It was agreed after much deliberation that relief aid would be provided. This, however, came too late. The fall of two of humanity's systems was all it took for the small mammal species to declare a crusade against the Orus. The Orus fleet's continuation into human space then gave the humans the right under common galactic law to defend themselves, and what the galaxy saw when humanity went to war has been carved into the very fabric of the Milky Way. Everywhere the human fleets traveled in their crusade, a specter followed. At first it was believed to be a parasitic species, thriving on the remains of the conflict one encounter at a time. As the war grew, however, this parasite began to change. It stopped following the humans and began to travel ahead of them, the specter becoming an omen to all that saw it. Beware, for the humans are coming, and in their wake only I remain. It hung over star systems like a shadow, passing light years in the blink of an eye. Some in the galactic sphere believed this to be a latent psychic ability of the humans, a projection of intent, though they were wrong, for when the last remnants of the auras had fallen, and only their god remained, this specter that had followed humanity to the gates of hell and devoured everything they had left behind, showed itself. For a god is merely mortal without a species to preside over, and humanity's god looked down on Nordaka with disgust, its skeletal maw twisting in a mockery of humanity's image to sneer at the fallen god one last time before finally offering it peace and destruction. The galaxy learned that day that for all the love and care that humanity offered, the god of death always walks in step with a human. The patron saint of humans, Part 2. The human representatives at the trial for the destruction of the Orus sat uneasily quietly as the other races discussed what they should do. The pantheon of gods watching from an observation platform above, two vacant seats sending an icy chill down anyone who looked upon them. Death stared across the room at the small mammal species it had decided to cultivate, a glint of desire consuming the darkness of its eyes as it sat, alone. Death knew the other gods were holding similar discussions from above. It was only natural, but it didn't matter. When their races finally succumbed to the eons of time, Death would be there, waiting, regardless of their judgment. Do they really want to incite the ire of the beginning and the end? Would they risk a fate worse than death? Eternal mortality? The mortal proceedings continued, and Death felt a smile settle upon itself. It stood and walked across the room, silencing the court as it did. It outstretched a hand to one of the humans, their gaze still locked on Death's pedestal. "It is time," echoed a voice as though from a great distance. A moment later, the human fell limp in their chair. The court erupted in protest and accusation as Death returned to their seat, followed by shouts of "Murderer!" and "The disrespect!" One representative called on their god to arrest it, for retribution. But the gods did not answer. Instead, they sat patiently, watching the humans. The human delegation had not joined in the protest like the others, and instead mirrored one another with a look of realization. They carefully laid their friend and colleague on the floor, closing their eyes. One removed their suit jacket and placed it over them in respect, and for a moment they were in silent contemplation. For humans had short lives and looked to preserve it wherever and whenever they could, and in this they would preserve it in memory. Death smiled as it saw bloom yet another source in humanity it could feed its lust, as memory is a fickle thing, and even that one day will die. Time stood from the observatory and cast down its judgment, a statement that left a visible sourness in some of the other gods. Death is inevitable. Even time will one day cease to pass. No, only death will remain, in service for eternity, and death smiled. The patron saint of humans, Part 3. Humanity closed its borders, sanctions and embargoes leaving them to reconsider its position in the galaxy. Parliaments across the human bubble argued the conflict deep into the darkness. Silence emanated from human space. In their absence, death turned its back on them, moving out into the abyss. Supply lines frozen, trade deals ended, the support of humanity dead to trillions. It swam through the void, taking in the aftermath of the galaxy's new war against the humans. And the humans? They didn't even know it was happening. The space around the human bubble began to fall silent. Without the support of the humans for food, colonies began to starve, and a new shadow passed across the borders of human territory. Time watched on as his Eldar race failed to take heed of his warning, and they retreated. Nature blossomed in their wake, leaving worlds of lush landscapes awaiting the next sentient species to arise or arrive. The god of famine awoke, staring up at the bone-white figure before it. The time of sleep was over. Death called once more for an offering, and even the god, starved of its own mortality, could not oppose death's will. The humans looked out into the stars, and where they once saw hope, there was only death. Where once vibrant cities were alive with commerce, now stood forests of tree and metal, nature reclaimed. They expanded out, looking for those they once called their friends, only to find monuments in their memory. Humanity was alone, and they solemnly accepted death as company. War blazed an inferno through the stars as the gods resigned themselves to their old duties. Even peace must die so that one day a new life may blossom, learned from time's records of transgressions. And as the galaxy rent itself, gods fell. The Eldar retreated into obscurity, leaving the younger races to fight over the land they left behind. The gods of war and chaos presiding over the turmoil, knowing it would only be a matter of time before one of them would be laid to rest. The Gormand were, in the end, victorious, a brutish species where might was key to their survival. The god of chaos retreated into the inky void, licking at its mortality as it mused its own creation at the start of time. Death stared into the blackness of space, its eyes locked on the cooling entropy of the universe. As tensions relaxed and humanity continued to voyage out into the silence, a new god was born. An old alliance rekindled between humans and Eldar, coexisting on the fringes of space, and as time sat watching, writing down its passing, a new race was birthed into the galaxy, the patron saint of humans, Part 4. Peace blossomed into the galaxy. Love and peace walked hand in hand, cooling the tensions of interplanetary turmoil and bringing about a new era of harmony. Time smiled as it watched the different races lift themselves back out of the shadows and into the light. Decades of conflict forgotten with generations past, a fresh start. Humanity brokered a new federation of species, cooperation between systems renewed, from the most unlikely of places. As the Federation grew, time felt a presence it knew all too well. It cast its gaze ahead and saw death waiting for it. They smiled at one another, and time offered death a place next to it. Death nodded and sat, looking down on a galaxy renewed. Old civilizations, stagnant and sedentary, washed aside for their complacency, to be replaced by something new. A small bead of ethereal light fell from under Death's hood as it watched, and time smiled a knowing smile. Time and again they had sat together in silence, watching the birth of their creations, as though for the first time. In time, this passing had become just another day. But death came and went, its mind always looking to the end of things. To see such beauty gripped death, and gave it pause, gave it but a moment in the vast eons of existence to appreciate the birth of things. Memory became forgotten laws, and as empires grew, new laws were laid atop the graves of those memories. Humanity's expansion halted as the other races grew to meet them, defining borders and setting up treaties. The galactic sphere looked different this time. The Eldar race hid in the shadows, fear eating away at their once great power, corrupting them into self-destruction. Peace, war, harmony, chaos stood by their races in protest at one another's expansion efforts, and each time they did, the gods looked to humanity. Why were they feared again? They thought to themselves, and death dried its eyes, for memory is a fickle thing, and only time will know all that has passed. As tensions rose and humanity watched, they couldn't help but feel like this had all happened before. Chaos moved to engulf the territories peace had sought to covet, its race of celestial beings moving from star to star, devouring them and leaving each system in darkness. The galaxy convened to discuss what should be done, and it was decided that these beings were too rare to destroy, and it was no fault of the own for what they are. Aid was sent too late, and death rose from its seat beside time, the call of the end once again sounding throughout the galaxy. Time held up its hand and beckoned death to wait, just a moment. But time knew that death had a duty. It watched its Eldar race begin to forget, the frailty of mind present even in them, and they grew. War raged in the galaxy as a shadow once again consumed peace, and time wept, for it alone must watch, and it alone must record all in its passage. Death walked among the stars, its hand gliding over the last embers of their existence before finally smothering their light, and time knew it was the end. A lone star sat against the darkness, the last vestiges of civilizations deteriorating, turning to dust against a solar backdrop of shadow. They huddled together, staving off the harsh coldness of night as a coarse chill slowly gripped the light of day and turned it deathly. Ice crept among their hearts, human and Eldar, till nothing remained but time. Death crept ever closer, looking down on the last two creations with admiration, and finally, it embraced them. The light of their star slowly fading in the loving embrace of death, eternal. Time smiled, the pen it held dancing across the pages of its tomb, painting a tapestry of what transpired. Death placed a hand on the back of Time's, and it smiled. It lifted the book containing all of history from Time's grasp, for nothing more could be written by an immortal being. Time looked down at the crumbling world its creation had lived its last days, surviving till the end, their long lives bringing them from dust to dusk. Death placed the tomb within its robe before stepping up to Time. It smiled up at Death and nodded, the words that it had heard hanging in the void between them. Death outstretched a hand and Time looked at it, trying to remember what happens next. "What will you do?" it asked, staring up at the bone-white figure before it. "I think I'll take up reading while I wait for time to begin anew," it said with a sympathetic grin. Time smiled as it took Death's hand, and it saw nothing. Death closed the book it had read for an eternity and looked up at the newcomer. "In time, even the eternal return,"